Diesel is not just a fuel for trucks. It is one of the quietest and most essential fuels behind the American economy. Most people never buy diesel directly. They do not see it on a grocery receipt. They do not see it when a package arrives at the door. They do not see it embedded in the price of building materials, farm products, or the goods sitting on store shelves. But diesel is present in all of those things. It moves trucks. It carries freight. It runs farm equipment, construction vehicles, delivery fleets, and warehouses across the country. And when diesel becomes expensive, that pressure does not stop at the pump. It travels through the supply chain. It reaches businesses. It reaches stores. And eventually, it can reach ordinary households through the price of the things they buy every day. On June 1st, 2026, the U.S. Energy Information Administration reported that the national average price for on-highway diesel stood at $5.35 per gallon. That was lower than the previous week, but it was still $1.89 higher than a year earlier. That is the central tension. Diesel can ease from one week to the next. But when it remains nearly $2 above where it was 12 months ago, the pressure does not disappear. For truckers, that difference is an operating cost. For small businesses, it is part of delivery, service, and shipping expenses. For farmers and contractors, it is tied to equipment and transportation. For families, it tends to arrive indirectly, hidden inside the price of goods that had to be produced, moved, stored, and delivered before reaching the shelf. This does not mean diesel alone explains inflation. It does not mean every price increase traces back to diesel. And it does not mean every added fuel cost is automatically passed on to the consumer. The more precise way to think about it is this. Diesel is a cost channel, one part of a larger system that connects energy markets to everyday life. That system begins long before a shopper walks into a store. Crude oil moves into refineries. Refineries convert it into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other products. Diesel falls under the broader distillate fuel category. From there, refinery output, inventory levels, regional supply conditions, and demand all shape the price that truckers and businesses ultimately pay at the pump. That fuel cost becomes part of freight. Freight becomes part of distribution. Distribution becomes part of what retailers and producers spend. And those costs can influence what households pay for food, household goods, construction, delivery, and everyday services. That is why diesel is so often felt without ever being seen. The latest supply data explains why this matters right now. For the week ending May 29, 2026, the EIA reported that U.S. refineries were operating at 94.7% of operable capacity. That is a high utilization rate. In practical terms, it means the system was already running hard to produce fuel, which leaves less room to absorb disruptions. A refinery outage, maintenance problem, regional bottleneck, or sudden supply shift carries more weight when the system has limited flexibility built in. This does not mean a shortage is happening. The verified data does not support that claim. But it does mean the fuel system behind freight and delivery is operating under conditions worth watching. In the same report, distillate fuel production averaged 5.2 million barrels per day. That figure matters because diesel supply depends directly on what refineries produce. If diesel is the fuel behind trucks and logistics, distillate production is one of the key numbers behind diesel availability. Inventories also improved during that week, rising by 1.5 million barrels. That was a positive development. But even after that build, distillate stockpiles were still about 3% below the 5-year average for that time of year. That distinction is worth holding on to. Inventories moved in the right direction. But the supply cushion remained below normal. For businesses that depend on diesel, that matters because it affects how much protection the market has against disruptions or unexpected shifts in demand. For households, the impact is indirect. But a thinner supply buffer can keep diesel more sensitive to changes in weather, refining conditions, or regional markets. Now consider the scale of what diesel actually supports. The American Trucking Associations reported that trucks moved roughly 72.7% of the nation's freight by weight in 2024. That number explains why diesel is not simply a trucking issue. When trucks carry nearly 3/4 of all freight by weight, their fuel costs become embedded in the movement of goods across the country. Food has to move. Retail products have to move. Construction materials have to move. Medical supplies have to move. The modern economy depends on constant, reliable transportation. And diesel is one of the primary fuels making that possible. For a trucker, diesel is not a background cost. It is one of the most visible expenses in the business. When the national price is $5.35 per gallon, and nearly $2 above what it was a year ago, that gap becomes a significant burden, particularly for smaller carriers who have less pricing power and fewer options. Large companies may have contracts, scale, and fuel surcharge mechanisms built into their agreements. Smaller operators often do not. Some costs can be passed along. Some get absorbed. Some reduce margins. Some result in higher charges for shippers. And that is where the path from diesel to consumer prices becomes complicated. It is not a straight line from the fuel pump to the grocery shelf. It is a chain. And every link in that chain makes a decision. A trucking company may add a fuel surcharge. A shipper may accept it, negotiate it, or delay it. A retailer may absorb higher transportation costs for a period. A manufacturer may adjust prices. A delivery service may revise its fees. A small business may raise service rates or accept tighter margins. By the time that cost reaches a household, it no longer carries a label. It may appear as a slightly higher grocery bill, a delivery charge that is a few dollars more, a repair quote that comes in higher than expected, a contractor who cannot hold last year's price, a service visit that costs more than it used to. That is how a hidden cost becomes a household cost. Quietly, gradually, and without its name ever appearing on the receipt. The regional data adds another layer to this picture. On June 1, 2026, EIA reported that diesel in California averaged $7.05 per gallon. The West Coast as a whole averaged $6.39. The Gulf Coast averaged $4.90. Those are not minor differences. A carrier operating on the West Coast faces a fundamentally different fuel environment than one running routes near the Gulf Coast. A business shipping through California operates under a different cost structure than one in a lower fuel cost region. For consumers, this helps explain why national averages can obscure local pressure. A single national diesel number may tell one story. A regional freight route may be experiencing something quite different. That matters for grocery distribution, port-related logistics, construction supply chains, agriculture, and delivery networks concentrated in higher-cost regions. For most Americans, diesel is invisible because gasoline gets the attention. Gasoline is what drivers purchase. Gasoline is the number on the sign people notice as they pass a station. Diesel, for the average household, stays out of view. But in economic terms, diesel reaches further than the driver. It is tied to the movement of goods, the cost of operating equipment, freight logistics, farms, construction sites, and retail supply chains across the country. A family buying groceries may not think about the truck that delivered the food to their store. A homeowner arranging repairs may not think about the diesel running the service vehicles. A small business receiving inventory may not consider the fuel cost built into the freight rate. But those costs are part of the system. They may not dominate any single final price, but they shape the pressure businesses are navigating. And when businesses face sustained pressure, households tend to feel it eventually. The key word is eventually. Some businesses have pricing power, some do not. Some pass costs through quickly, others delay. Some absorb them for competitive reasons. The path varies from industry to industry, company to company, and contract to contract. The weekly data gives some useful context. On May 18, 2026, the national diesel price stood at $5.59 per gallon. On May 25th, it was $5.52. By June 1st, it had moved down to $5.35. Diesel was declining week over week through that period. That matters and should not be ignored. But the year-over-year gap still holds significance. Even after those weekly declines, diesel remained nearly $2 higher than a year earlier. The story is not that diesel is surging this week. The story is that diesel remained elevated compared with the same time last year. While inventories sat below the 5-year average and refineries were running at high utilization, those are signals of pressure, not proof of crisis, not a guarantee of future price increases, but real conditions worth understanding inside the fuel system. For truckers, that pressure affects operating costs. For retailers, it affects logistics budgets. For farmers, it affects production and transport expenses. For small businesses, it is one more cost making daily operations harder to manage. And for families, it contributes to the background cost of ordinary life. Groceries, deliveries, repairs, services, construction, without ever appearing by name. That is how diesel functions like a hidden tax. Not a government levy in any formal sense, but an added cost that moves quietly through the economy. It may be paid first by a trucker, then by a shipper, then by a retailer, and finally by a consumer. Or it may be partially absorbed somewhere along the way. The direction of pressure, though, is consistent. Higher diesel raises the cost of moving the physical economy. And America's physical economy still depends heavily on trucks. This matters especially now because many households are already managing other elevated costs. Food, housing, insurance, utilities, transportation, and debt payments. When budgets are already stretched, indirect cost pressure matters more, not less. A few extra dollars on a grocery run may not carry a visible explanation. A delivery fee may not reflect the fuel behind it. A service charge may not separate labor from transportation costs. But households feel the total. They do not live inside economic categories. They live inside monthly budgets. And the budget does not distinguish between costs that came from fuel, rent, labor, or freight. It only registers what is left after the bills are paid. That is the broader meaning of where diesel prices stand today. Diesel is not simply a commodity. It is a connector linking refineries to freight, freight to stores, stores to households, and households to the larger energy system. When that connector becomes expensive, the effects can spread. Quietly, gradually, and usually without announcement. The key figures in this story are not only government agencies or industry associations. They are the truck driver fueling up before a long route, the small business owner waiting on inventory, the farmer running equipment through a season, the contractor managing materials, the delivery company adjusting routes, and the family reviewing a grocery receipt that keeps coming in a little higher than expected. The consumer tends to be last in the chain, and often the one with the least ability to pass the cost along to someone else. As of the most recent verified data, diesel had declined from the prior week, but remained sharply higher than a year earlier. Refineries were operating at high utilization. Distillate production was running at a strong pace. Inventories improved during the week, but still sat below the 5-year seasonal average. Those facts do not support alarm, but they do support attention. What remains open is how long diesel prices will stay elevated, how much of the cost will move through the supply chain, and which industries and households will absorb the most pressure. The numbers to watch going forward include weekly diesel prices, refinery utilization rates, distillate production and inventory levels, freight rates, fuel surcharges, and the commentary from companies operating in transportation and logistics. For ordinary Americans, the conclusion is straightforward. Diesel may not appear anywhere in the family budget, but it can still shape the cost of that budget. It moves the trucks, it supports the farms, it helps run construction and delivery, it carries goods through every stage of the supply chain. And when diesel is expensive, that cost travels, quietly, gradually, and most of the time, without its name ever appearing on the receipt.